Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode. In this episode, we're going to discuss what happens if the government wants to fight inflation. Now, for those of you who are not aware, inflation is currently one of the top economic issues in the United States. The Consumer Price Index has been increasing by over 8% per year, which means that the American dollar is becoming less valuable every single day. And it can be really hard sometimes to understand exactly how the government tries to fight against inflation, because they have so many different levers that they can pull. But in this episode, we're going to discuss exactly how the government fights inflation and the three main ways that they do this: through fiscal policy, monetary policy, or price control. Before we begin, I would appreciate if you could like this video. It helps out tremendously, and if you have any questions at the end, comment them down below, because I will be doing my best to answer all of them. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy refers to the use of government spending and tax policies to influence macroeconomic conditions, including inflation. So when the government adjusts their spending and taxes, this affects aggregate demand, which is the total demand for goods and services in an economy. So if the government wants to fight inflation, they can use fiscal policy to cool down the economy. They do this by decreasing government spending and/or increasing taxes. This makes the economy produce less and therefore lowers the amount of demand there is for goods and services. Lowering the amount of demand helps to lower prices and therefore fight inflation. Now, there are some downsides to fighting inflation with fiscal policy. For example, when the government decreases their spending or increases taxes, this takes money away from the economy. And this can slow down the economy too much, leading to a recession. But still, overall, fiscal policy is one of the main tools that the government uses to fight inflation. Monetary policy. Monetary policy refers to the actions undertaken by a central bank to manipulate the supply of money in an economy. In the United States, the central bank is called the Federal Reserve, and they can manipulate the money supply to influence inflation. So there are two main tools that the Federal Reserve uses to change the money supply: the federal funds rate and reserve requirements. The federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other for loans. When the Fed wants to increase interest rates, they raise the federal funds rate. This makes borrowing more expensive, which decreases the money supply and therefore cools down the economy. The Fed can also change reserve requirements, which is the percentage of their deposits that banks are required to keep on hand. When the Fed wants to increase interest rates, they decrease reserve requirements. This gives banks more money to lend out, which increases the money supply and therefore heats up the economy. So what does this mean for inflation? Well, when the Fed raises interest rates by increasing the federal funds rate and/or decreasing reserve requirements, this makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow money. This leads to less investment and less economic growth, which lowers inflation. However, just like with fiscal policy, there are some downsides to this as well. For example, when the Fed raises interest rates, this can lead to a recession. Also, monetary policy only works if people and businesses believe that the central bank is credible. If people think that the central bank will not be able to raise interest rates as much as they say they will, then they may not take the necessary steps to fight inflation. Price control. Price controls refer to government-imposed limits on how much businesses can charge for their goods and services. In the United States, the most common type of price control is a price ceiling, which is a maximum price that can be charged for a good or service. For example, during the 1970s, the US government imposed a price ceiling on gasoline in an effort to combat inflation. The price ceiling was set at $3.50 per gallon, which was well below the market equilibrium price of 4 cents per gallon. As a result, there was a shortage of gasoline in the United States. Because the price ceiling was set below the market equilibrium price, consumers were willing to purchase more gasoline at $3.50 per gallon than producers were willing to sell. This led to a shortage of gasoline, which caused long lines at the gas station, and even in some cases, gas station owners had to completely shut down their operations. Another example of price control is a price floor, which is a minimum price that can be charged for a good or service. In the United States, the most common type of price floor is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a price floor set by the federal government that all states must abide by. This means that all employers in the United States must pay their employees at least the federal minimum wage, which is currently $7.25 per hour. The minimum wage is intended to protect workers from being exploited by their employers. Without the minimum wage, workers could be paid less than what they are worth, which would allow businesses to take advantage of them. By setting a minimum wage, the government ensures that workers are paid a fair price for their labor. But how do price controls help fight inflation? Well, let's say that the price of milk is increasing because the price of corn is increasing. Corn is used to make milk, so as the price of corn goes up, the price of milk also goes up. This is an example of cost-push inflation. One way the government could fight this type of inflation is by imposing a price ceiling on milk. By setting the price of milk below the market equilibrium price, the government would be able to reduce the price of milk for consumers. This would help to offset the increase in the price of corn and would help to keep overall inflation low. Now, price controls do have their own set of problems. For example, price ceilings can lead to shortages and price floors can lead to surpluses. Also, price controls are often seen as a sign of government failure. When the government sets prices, it sends a signal to businesses that the government is taking over and that businesses should not be allowed to set their own prices. This can lead to a loss of business confidence in the economy and can cause investment to decline, which can lead to slower economic growth. Which method is best? So out of these three methods, which one is the best way to fight inflation? Well, that's actually a really tough question to answer. Each method has its own pros and cons. Fiscal policy is great because it's targeted and can be adjusted quickly. However, it also faces significant political opposition and can be difficult to implement. Monetary policy is also great because it's flexible and can be implemented quickly. However, it can be difficult to know the right amount of inflation to target and can lead to unintended consequences. Price control is probably the worst option because it's inflexible and can lead to shortages and surpluses. It can also send a signal to businesses that the government is taking over and that they should not be allowed to set their own prices. However, in the end, the best way to fight inflation is probably a combination of all three methods. By using a combination of fiscal, monetary, and price control policies, the government can target inflation more effectively and reduce the risk of unintended consequences. Conclusion. Inflation is a serious economic issue, and the government has a responsibility to take action to control it. The government has three main methods to fight inflation: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and price control. Each method has its own pros and cons, but in the end, the best way to fight inflation is probably a combination of all three. I hope that you found this video helpful, and if you did, please leave a like. Also, if you have any questions, comment them down below because I will be doing my best to answer all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.